Welcome everyone. So I've had quite a few people ask me to share my force feedback settings for Assetto Corsa, and I've seen a lot of people having issues with twitchiness or oscillations in their wheel. So rather than just sharing my settings for the car packs that I use, I took it upon myself to find a good universal starting point regardless of the car pack being used. I spent weeks testing various force feedback configurations using a range of car packs and track mods, and I feel the following settings yield the best results. The process of setting up your force feedback in general is the same no matter the game being played. Ultimately, you want to set the game force feedback as close to 100% as possible without clipping to provide a clean signal with maximum dynamic frequency to your wheel driver. And then your wheel driver software is used to adjust overall strength and feel. So with that said, let's move on to some things that you'll need. There are three things that we're going to need in order to maximize Assetto Corsa's force feedback effects. The first thing we're going to need is Content Manager. This is going to act as our game launcher and allows us to adjust various settings for your game. There's a free and a paid version, though I recommend the paid version as it opens up a lot more possibilities and makes installing and managing mods much easier. The next thing we're going to need is the latest version of Custom Shaders Patch. This can be downloaded and installed manually or installed through Content Manager. This brings us a few force feedback tweaks that really change how the game feels in a positive way. The last item we're going to need is the Force Feedback Clip app. This gives us a force feedback graph to work with when we're adjusting each car in-game. I'm not going to go over installing any of these as they're pretty straightforward and there are plenty of guides online showing how to do so. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's move on to Race Manager settings. Race Manager is where we're going to adjust our overall strength and feel of the force feedback effects going through our wheel. Again, take note, I'm using the latest beta firmware and software, so your Race Manager may look different from mine and you may yield different results. However, the principle is the same regardless of the firmware you're running. So the goal with our settings in Race Manager is to keep the force feedback coming through the wheel as pure and smooth as possible without compromising too much on detail or fidelity. Consider my settings a balanced setup and they could be tweaked to either end of the spectrum. We're going to begin with total force here. Here we're going to set a good overall strength that feels good across all of the cars that we plan on driving. I suggest 60 as a starting point and should only be adjusted if the wheel is too strong or too weak across the majority of cars that you drive. Once you find a good strength for you, leave the setting alone. Next up, we have wheel speed. With this, we want to keep it as close to 100 as possible, as reducing this too much introduces a damping effect. Lowering this value can mitigate twitchiness and oscillations, but comes at the cost of reduced detail. I recommend starting at 100 and going from there. Here we have wheel damper. I leave this at 0 as we have dynamic damping coming from the game. Raising this setting up can help with twitchiness and oscillations, but also restricts wheel return speed, thus reducing fidelity and detail. I recommend leaving this at 0 as this is a constant effect and it's always active. Now, overall filter or filter frequency for the latest versions of Race Manager have been reversed. 0 is 100% filter and 100 is 0% filter. Raising this closer to 100 will give more detail but can introduce resonance or graininess and notchiness. Setting this closer to 0 will yield a smoother wheel but compromises on detail. I recommend 25 on the newer version of Race Manager or 75 on the older versions, which would be about 75% filter. For me, I find this provides a nicer feeling experience. Experiment and find what feels good to you. Next up is wheel spring. This is another constant effect that hinders force feedback effects when turned up too much. I recommend setting this to 5 just to keep the wheel from locking onto the bump stop at low speeds. Any higher and it starts to become counterintuitive to the self-steering forces being sent by the game. Here we have wheel friction. This again is another constant effect not provided by the game. This acts as a damper and adds a stickiness to the wheel, kind of like tires on hot pavement. This setting can also help with oscillations and twitchiness, as well as round out the overall feel of the wheel. I recommend leaving this at 0 or as close to 0 as possible, as this becomes counterintuitive at higher levels. Suspension settings. These are found on the state page in older versions of Race Manager. The latest versions of Race Manager moved them up front to the settings page here. Older Race Manager also has 5 settings instead of the 3 you see here. Soft suspension would be like driving a Cadillac with shock absorbers or airbags, and makes the force feedback feel softer or mushier. Setting this to a softer setting can help with twitchiness or oscillations. Hard is more like an F1 suspension. It provides stiffer and sharper feeling force feedback, but can also introduce or boost twitchiness in the wheel. I recommend normal, as has a good balance. Now, response here affects how Race Manager treats the force feedback signal. Stable mode is closer to the original output of the game, whereas wild mode, the affected output details will be increased. I noticed for my version of Race Manager, these settings seem to have a reversed effect. Stable seems to provide more fidelity, whereas wild seems to provide smoother force feedback with increased damping effects and lower fidelity. So I prefer stable setting, and experiment yourself and see what works for you. All the other settings here we're going to leave at 100, as to not reduce the dynamic range of the force feedback signal coming from the game. So with all of that out of the way, let's move on to Content Manager. Here in Content Manager, we have a few things we need to adjust. We're going to start off by clicking on Settings at the top here, Assetto Corsa, Controls, and then Force Feedback. We're going to put our gain at 100%, as we're going to be adjusting on a per car basis in-game, and we don't want any limitations. Invert FFB, we're going to leave unchecked. Filter, I leave at 0. However, if you're experiencing force feedback spikes, or you're finding that the force feedback is too sharp, you can raise this up and that will smooth things out for you. Minimum force, we're going to leave at 0. Effects, these are canned effect sliders. Things like curb and road you're going to get naturally through your force feedback, as well as ABS if you run ABS. With my beta firmware, I didn't get any slip effects, so I added 7% just to liven up the wheel. Remember, these are subjective, so adjust these to your personal taste. Soft lock we're going to enable, and skip FFB steps we're going to leave at 0, just to maximize the signal being sent to Race Manager. All other settings that you see here we'll leave at default. If you downloaded and installed FFB Clip app, we need to enable it by going up to Apps here, making sure Enable Python Apps has a check mark, as well as FFB Clip. Once you've done that, we're going to head over to Custom Shaders Patch, About and Updates, and you're going to make sure you're running the latest version, which at the time of this video is 1.73 for the public version, and 1.74 Preview 33 for the RainFX Patreon version. So once you've got that up to date, we're going to head over to FFB Tweaks here on the left, and we're going to make sure that's active. We're also going to activate this McPherson Struct FFB adjustment, as this improves the cars overall. However, take note, car packs like the Downsyde Garage, this actually breaks the force feedback, so you'll have to disable this prior to running them. The next one we're going to activate is disable FFB during loading. We don't want our wheel doing anything sporadic when we're not in game. The next setting, more physically accurate gyro implementation. This is subjective. Personally, I feel this improves the force feedback and makes the wheel feel more natural. I've also lowered the default 25% down to 15. I found the default strength to be a bit too much. I do have a link down below with more information on this if you'd like to read up, experiment, and see what suits you best. So the next one we're going to activate is output real steering forces to wheel. This is going to enable real steering forces for cars that include the required physics code. We're also going to set our wheel peak torque to 10 Newton meters, as that's the maximum output of our wheelbase. And if you're running RainFX from Patreon, they've actually added a couple new settings under general patch settings here. Scroll down. They've added a new physics tweaks option, and this use double precision physics engine is supposed to help with precision issues on large tracks. So the further away from spawn that you drive on these large tracks, the more noise and vibrations you get through the wheel, and it becomes fairly unpleasant. This is supposed to fix that, or at least help mitigate those issues. The other two settings is up to you if you use them. After that, we're going to head over to drive. You're going to choose a car that you plan on setting up, and then you're going to choose a track that is going to push the force feedback signal. So you're going to want something with a higher grip level, something with some hills, bumps, varying corners. You don't want to choose a track that's flat and low grip, because you'll find that you're going to keep adjusting your car every time you change tracks. So we want to maximize the output so that we could set it and forget it. The next thing you want to do is make sure that you're running no assists. Things like traction control and stability control, they're going to hinder your force feedback experience, and they're going to fight you. Another thing to take note is mechanical damage. Some of these car packs, after a lap or two, your tires will blow up, so you may want to reduce this down to 0. Another setting that you can adjust is the track grip. If you want to push the force feedback, you can set it to optimum while you're doing your adjustments, and then set it back to whatever you prefer. Optimum, I find, is unrealistic, and generally online servers don't run this. I tend to run green. I find it's more natural. I also find that running a lower grip will help with twitchiness and oscillations during transitions. So with all of that set up, we're going to head in game. Here in game is where we'll be adjusting our cars to eliminate clipping and create an overhead or buffer. This in turn will provide us with a clean signal for Race Manager and gives us some headroom for when we change tracks or setups. First thing I recommend is swapping to the highest grip tire that you plan on using with your current car. This is going to help maximize the force feedback signal being output by the game. Running tire blankets and optimal track grip will also help push the force feedback signal and help us to eliminate clipping in our car. As far as gear ratio or car setup, I suggest applying it now. Next, we're going to click on Drive. We're going to bring up our apps menu on the right here, all apps. We're going to enable FFB clip by clicking on it, as well as force feedback controller. Now before we can start using the FFB clip app, we need to make some changes, which we're going to do by clicking on Options. We're going to enable manual override to prevent the app from making any automatic adjustments to us. We're also going to enable direct drive mode, as this treats the force feedback signal slightly differently. Default torque target and hardware max target we're going to put to 10. Graph display, we're going to click on this so it says graph. Graph refresh, we're going to set to 15 or higher. This is the refresh rate of the graph. These other two values are not needed, so don't worry about them. Now we're going to click on exit. The force feedback controller app will be used to make the actual adjustments to our car, which is currently at 100. My recommended starting value is 60, which we're going to apply right now. I also suggest reducing all of these other effects down to 0, so they don't interfere with our adjustment process. Now if the name of your car happens to cover up this setting here and you're unable to see the value, the third number on the FFB clip app also shows what your car is set to, as well as suggested values indicated in the first two numbers here. Now the green line in FFB clip app represents the force feedback signal being output by the game, which will begin moving once we start driving. The red line here is your clipping limit, which is adjusted by setting the torque target up top here. Currently it's set to 10 Newton meters, the max output of our wheelbase. You can leave it at 10 and adjust your car to the max output, but that will only adjust your car for the current track, and it doesn't allow any headroom for any unforeseen clipping due to varying track mods or car setups. So I found that setting the torque target to 7 allows me to consistently adjust all my cars to a good level without having to retweak them later. Where you set it to make your adjustments is up to you. We are now going to head on track and warm up our tires. As we drive, we're going to pay attention to the force feedback graph and the suggested values that FFB clip recommends. These values will fluctuate as we drive and are affected by driver performance. The more consistent that you drive, the more accurate the suggestion will be. Once we drive a couple laps, we're going to match the suggested value and continue testing. After 5 to 10 laps of smooth, consistent driving, the recommended values should level out and be roughly in line with your car setting, give or take a few points. At this point, depending on where you set your torque target, your car should be in a good spot with minimal to no clipping. The final step is to bring in any effects we plan on using, then continue driving, making sure the force feedback signal isn't clipping and the overall feeling from the effect settings are where we want it. Once satisfied, make sure to click on the save button and close out both apps until you're ready to adjust your next car. Make sure to give yourself time to adjust to new settings, and if necessary, you can always adjust the settings in Race Manager after you're done adjusting your car in-game. Hopefully, all the information I provided in this guide helps you on your way to finding your perfect settings. And with that, I thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you all later. Peace.